out there in Facebook land and also the real world. It's got Curt and the other guy here tonight with you. Other guy, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great.
Good. Glad to have you back on here. I think you were on once or twice before, so we're happy to have you on. Um,
Yep.
so I'm going to go ahead and announce what we're going to talk about, and then maybe just have you tell a little bit about yourself, and without giving away your secret identity or the location of the Bat Cave. All right.
Right.
Um, so basically, we have a pretty simple purpose. We're trying to encourage civil dialogue in our society. It seems to be an art that is losing practice in our society. People seem to pick sides and dig in and not want to talk, and listen to one another. But we're trying to encourage that, whether it be religious topics, spiritual topics, political topics, whatever we happen to be talking about. Let's try to be polite and kind one to another. We also are trying to encourage participation. And by that, of course, we think it's a good idea to vote, to speak out on issues. We have no problem, again, doing that politely. But we think it's really important that you get involved in your local community. And by that, we're talking about your family, a local church. If you happen to be, there's scouts and there's organizations in your community that maybe are homeless, helping the homeless, or big brothers and big sisters. I know here in the Louisville area, we have a couple of refugee ministries where you can help folks who are refugees. But let's get involved. And then I think it's important to get involved with our neighbors and get to know our neighbors and the people that we live around, and just take an active part in our lives, and not just be a keyboard warrior or someone who just talks about things all the time. So we want to encourage civil dialogue. Number two, we want to encourage participation. And then number three, always, always, always have fun when you do number one and number two, and especially when you do number two. And if you're not having fun doing number two, you try squatty potty. That's our advice. We don't know what else to tell you. There may be some other options out there, but we think squatty potty will help you. So our topic tonight, we're going to talk about, got a few current events. We want to talk a little bit about social justice. And I want to make sure that we get to that topic because I think you have some good ideas in that area, and maybe what we think social justice is and is not. And then finally, we're going to jump back into Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 21. So tell us, just first of all, before we get rolling too much, other guy, just tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about your background. And again, we don't want you to give away your secret identity, but we want people to know kind of where you're coming from. So
I identify as a man, a white
you
male.
identify as a man, okay. I got you.
Mostly because I am one.
Yes,
I
you appear to be one to me too. The facial hair.
Yeah. I'm a pastor in the eastern half of the United States.
Okay.
Got a wife, bunch of kids. I was in the military for a little while, and
all right.
I'm currently working on a degree in history, American religious history.
Okay.
And trying to say postgraduate degree.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to finish that.
Cool.
Focusing on American religion.
Cool. So how long were you in the military?
7 years.
Wow. I've known you for a while.
Yeah, part of that was National Guard, so.
Sure. But you volunteered, of course, right? Because we don't have a draft instituted. And you served in the Middle East there for a while?
Yeah, 2 tours in Iraq.
So you have seen some, I don't want to get way off track, but probably been in some combat situations and seen some things that, not everybody definitely has experienced.
Yeah, it's different over there.
Absolutely. But I respect people who do serve. I've got a son that is in the Air Force and a long family history of military service. I happen to be the only one from my grandfather to my son in that whole line that never did serve in the military. So definitely not because I'm anti-military. Just kind of life just didn't really work that way. So, but we appreciate your service there. So before we jump into social justice, I was going to talk a little bit about just a few quick headlines. There's so much going on lately. The first thing I want to tell everybody is I just kind of want to give a shout out to a company. I bought a car this past week. I actually bought 2 cars. Mine got totaled. Bambi's dad ran into me about 3 weeks ago in my car. And so I had to replace my car, and my wife's car was getting really old anyway. So I just decided to get 2 cars. Well, I got my first one, and I bought it through Carvana. Have you heard about Carvana?
I haven't.
So it's completely online, but I have a real car sitting in my driveway right now that's exactly what I bought. And it's pretty amazing. Their customer service has been tip-top, a number one. What I did is I went online, I looked at multiple vehicles. You can put in all kinds of parameters. They're all used. They literally have vending machines in certain cities. I think they have one in Nashville, one in Cleveland. And they give you a token if you buy a car and you can pick it up. But for me, I looked at several vehicles. I was more concerned about price, and I wanted a decent economy car, but I didn't want to just sit in like a Fiat or something, you know. So I ended up buying 2 Ford Focuses. So I guess I have Foci. Anyway, yeah. And the deal is they put them through a 150-point inspection. You're able to view 360 degrees inside out, read all the specs, car reports, everything. And then they deliver the car to you, okay? So they brought the car Tuesday night, and I literally have 7 days, no question asked. I can return that car anytime within 7 days. The only thing I would have to pay, I'd have to go back and look at it, but I think it's 10 cents a mile, anything over 400 miles in that 7 days. So it's a good car. I'm very happy with it. It has a 7-day return policy. They give you a 4-month bumper-to-bumper warranty. And then the other car I ordered had something wrong with a seal, not on the engine, but somewhere on the exterior. And they called me and said, hey, we don't want to bring it out to you with not everything being perfect. So they're going to fix that and bring it out in another week or 2. So I'll have my second car. So far, I'll give you guys an update next week or the next time we're on about Carvana. Easy. You didn't have to sit there and haggle with a salesperson. You're able to look online to see, is this a fair price for this car? Every car I looked at, very fair. So shout out to a new startup company. It's Forbes' fifth most promising company right now. So anyway, they said car dealerships are going the way of the dodo bird. So we'll see.
Good riddance.
Yeah. A couple other quick things. Shout out also to Gary Johnson. Did you hear what he's doing in New Mexico? Have you heard the news?
No, not yet.
He's running for senator in his home state of New Mexico as a libertarian. So I make no bones about it. I voted for him in 2016 for president. He obviously didn't win. But he has been elected governor twice. And right after he announced in a 3-way race, he was polling at 21%, only 11% behind the leader. So he has a legitimate shot in that race. And what a score that would be for the Libertarian Party if he were able to win a Senate seat. It would also create a little bit of a interesting dynamic in the Senate because I don't know what's going to happen with the House and the Senate this fall. I have a sneaking suspicion the Democrats are going to gain some seats. That's just my gut. That's what history says. We'll see what happens. But I think they are, and he could be a real player because he's neither a Democrat nor a Republican. So that would be really interesting. And I feel like whether you like libertarians or not, or libertarian philosophy, we definitely need some fresh ideas and some new faces. And I'll be honest with you, one of the reasons I voted for him is I felt like he was straightforward and honest and had some humility about it.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with every one of his positions by any means, but I agreed with more of his positions than I did the other two candidates. And, so anyway, you said you fought in Iraq. I've read several articles on this related to Afghanistan. Did you know that since the United States has invaded Afghanistan, that opium production has actually increased in the country of Afghanistan and not decreased?
They probably provide safety for them.
That's what I've been reading. It's just absolutely crazy. I know you fought, and I know you fought for good reasons, and sure. I believe that. But I don't. You probably follow some of what I write. I think it's time to get away from those countries and move on to.
Yeah,
we've got to do some different things now. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I was over there 07 and then again in 2011, 12, right there when we pulled out.
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of the immediate things that we were doing when we were there, which was pushing out terrorists, insurgents, establishing safe roads. Then there was the big picture, which was creating democracy and creating stable governments. I'm okay with the first one, show up, kind of fight people that are oppressing other people.
Yeah.
Same with Afghanistan, push the Taliban out. But the big goals, we just don't know what we're doing over there. We don't know how to manage countries, and you can just see the results. ISIS is a result of American interference.
Yeah, I agree. This past week, earlier this week, was the anniversary of the CIA coup in Iran, where we literally toppled a democratically elected leader of Iran, and we can look to see what has happened since then.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we need to stop and take a step back and consider, why do some of these people hate us?
Yeah.
They sometimes have reasons for it. And I don't mean the average American. I don't mean even the average enlisted person or I don't mean to say enlisted, just the average service person. That's not what I'm talking about. But we meddle in other countries. We have since about World War II, and that's not a way to create friends. And I think that countries that have democratic institutions or Republican forms of government, their societies and their cultures were ready for it, and they wanted it. And you can't force that on people. You can't make them want that or be able to handle it. And I think, if you look at the American Revolution, we were a society that was ready for a revolution and ready for a Republican form of government. Again, not to say that everything was perfect in the beginning, but can't force freedom. That kind of makes sense, really. How could you force freedom?
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan's a perfect example. We went over there thinking we'd free them from the Taliban, which was an evil, controlling dictatorship, and people wanted us to free them from the Taliban.
Sure.
And replace it with democracy. And what we learned was they don't want democracy. They want tribal governments. And so we were dumping money into these villages and tribes, and they didn't want it. And now what? They don't want the Taliban, but they don't want democracy. And we can't imagine someone not wanting democracy.
Right.
Because we've got it, so everyone should want it.
Right.
And we don't have an answer for that.
As a society, they don't. I think history also tells us that Alexander couldn't control Afghanistan. The Brits couldn't control it. The Russians couldn't control it.
Yeah.
We're pretty awesome, but maybe we can't control it either,
Probably
and then
not.
Finally, real quick, I just wanted to mention, it's a tragedy. The murder of the young lady out there in Iowa, Molly, I think her last name was Tibbetts. And that's always a tragedy. Anytime someone is murdered, I think that we could realistically talk about how many murders were in Chicago last week. That doesn't seem to get a lot of press time, I guess because it's old hat and commonplace, but I mean, literally hundreds of murders in Chicago this year. But I think that it's interesting to me, in our country, we have a left-right dichotomy. And when a gun that the left doesn't like is used in a school shooting, like what they consider an assault weapon, and we don't have to have that debate about what is an assault weapon or anything tonight, but they immediately push, when there's a tragedy, we need to control guns and we need to limit gun ownership. And you hear the right say, well, don't politicize a tragedy. And then Molly Tibbetts is murdered by an illegal alien. I'll use the term illegal alien. I don't have a problem with that. It's technically against the law to cross the border without permission of the U.S. government, okay? But it's a tragedy, but then we use that, well, we build the wall. Well, first of all, the wall wouldn't have stopped this guy. If he had come in through the front door, from what I've read, he had zero criminal background. None whatsoever. Nothing to tip anybody off. I don't know that they've even given a motive yet for why he murdered her. I'm also curious as to why the right can politicize a tragedy and it's okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And thirdly, I really am wondering, we're talking about limiting the flow of illegal immigrants, but we rarely talk about the corporations who are hiring illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
Maybe there should be some focus there. And to be very clear, I really don't see immigration, even illegal immigration, as a really large-scale problem, personally. I don't want to touch a bunch of emotional hot buttons tonight, but I did reread Cato's study on crime, and they said that in that study that illegal immigrants, not counting illegal immigration as a crime, the prison population, 0.5% of our prison population is made up of illegals, and they're 13% of the population, whereas native borns are 1.5% of the prison population. So it's, I think, a little disingenuous to just assume that because they cross a line without permission, they're going to commit all kinds of heinous crimes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and it's in a country as big as ours, there's always an event that supports your position.
Always will be.
So there's just too many people to not have something go wrong. And so when you're just looking for something, to give you an example, anecdotal evidence is not scientific. It's not the way you base it.
No, it's a very poor way to make decisions. And I know that our emotions affect us, but we have to kind of step back from our emotions and look at rational, factual statistics and make those decisions. And we also need to see what's going to be the ramification. I read an article too, I think I posted on Curt and the other guy last week, but under Hoover and Roosevelt, there was a literal rounding up of Mexican Americans in the early 1930s. And the numbers, I think it was 1.8 million Mexicans were deported during that time period. And if I remember correctly, it was either 40% or 60% of the people deported, 60% were actually citizens of the United States. But because of their appearance, they were rounded up, put on trains, and sent back. They didn't have their papers on them at the time. I think it's a very, very dangerous idea, I think due process of law is very important.
Yeah.
Whether a person is accused of being here legally or illegally or not, I think they're still a human being with certain rights.
Yeah, and the term illegal alien, which I've heard is maybe a little offensive, which I'm okay with using that as long as we use the term illegal Americans, referring to the people who hired. So let's be fair, and no one likes that idea. Like illegal Americans, they're still Americans just because they broke the law.
Yeah,
it's like, well, it just sounds bad though, doesn't it? So it's a two-sided problem. Immigrants don't show up when there's nothing to do. They show up because they know.
Immigrants don't what?
they don't show up when there's nothing to do. They show up
Right.
because there's an American who's going to hire them.
Right.
So who's more at fault, the one who's providing the illegal job or the one who's illegally taking the job? And I think that's the concept of justice right there. It's giving everyone a fair treatment and not siding with one side or the other.
Well, I think it was a good segue into social justice, because you said you wanted to talk a little bit about social justice before we jump into Matthew 5. So let me clarify one thing at the beginning. We kind of talked about this a little bit ahead of time. We're not talking about massive government force to redistribute wealth from the top 1% or 10% or 20% and making everyone equal in an income level per se, or guaranteeing that, necessarily, and I mean guaranteeing with government force now, that women will be paid exactly the same as men for the exact same job, or that there will never, ever be any discrimination in a nation of 325 million people. That's not necessarily what we're talking about, are we?
Yeah, so the term social justice has been co-opted in the past 5 years for sure, but even further back than that. So the term first was used in the about 1840s by Christians who were talking about what it means to live in a society where justice is present among people. And there's no controversy with it. It was, of course, you want a society that's just.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the 1970s, there was a philosophical shift. Philosophers shifting towards maybe Marxism a little bit, and a guy named John Rawls took the term social justice and changed its meaning to mean redistribution of wealth by the government.
Okay.
And that's where we get this recent idea of social justice equals the government forcing people to do things. But that's a late term, and it really means a society where people are treated justly, and really more of a focus on how they treat each other. And so the way, when you look at it from a historical and sort of a long-term view, you have two kinds of justice. You have public justice and you have social justice. Public justice is when the government puts a man on trial for murder and executes him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I believe, if or he steals bread and he's put in prison or something like that. That's that sort of the government punishing crime. And then social justice is that justice among the members of society. We don't treat people differently because of the country of origin or their ethnicity or their skin color. So when we talk about justice, it's public justice, social justice, how the government treats people, and then how people treat each other.
Okay.
And when you put in those terms, who isn't for that? Like, who doesn't want that kind of justice?
Right.
How we achieve that justice, okay, that's a different question. But the concept should be accepted across the board.
Yeah, I don't see how anybody would say, yeah, I think we should treat certain people as lower class citizens. I think we should mistreat someone because of the color of their skin, or we should mistreat someone because of a religious belief or non-religious belief. People, I think you and I agree here. People have God-given rights, and those rights are the right to pursue their own livelihood, to be free as long as they're not harming another human being. We call it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration. And I think it's dangerous. One of the things you mentioned was you talked about justice being fairness. And I think where we get maybe messed up sometimes is, especially the socialists and communists want equality of outcome. They want everybody to be the same in the outcome. But if you stop to think about that, any time that's ever been tried, it's failed.
Yeah.
It's never worked. You cannot have everybody the same because, okay, I'll give an example. I'm a fairly intelligent guy when it comes to books. I can read and understand. I'm pretty good with words. I can talk pretty well usually, those kinds of things. But if you told me, hey, build a house, I'm going to struggle immensely with that. Okay. Yeah. I'm not good in that area. Well, does that mean I'm stupid? It doesn't mean I'm stupid. It means I have a different talent, a different ability. But we're getting ready to have some work done on our house, and I have a friend who's going to come do the work. I mean, I'm going to pay him because that's fair and just. But you know, I think we have to understand that it's equality of opportunity that we're looking for. The opportunity to take care of yourself. And I think you and I would probably agree on this next thing I'm gonna say. I think we have an obligation as human beings to care for those who cannot care for themselves.
Yeah, I do agree. So when we talk about justice, the idea of treating fairly or giving people what's due to them, and what is due to people. What do people deserve by virtue of whatever? So I think there's two categories there. It's they deserve things by virtue of their personhood,
mm-hmm.
by being a person, by being a human, or however you want to classify it. The Christian concept is being made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
By virtue of that, you deserve to be treated a certain way. You deserve certain things. And then secondly, how you're treated based on your actions. If you violently attack people, it's just to lock you up. If you work hard, it's just that you would be paid in response to that. So there's what's due to you, what's due to every single person by virtue of their nature, their human nature, mm-hmm. and there's what's due to them by their actions. And I think the question everyone's struggling with, and maybe I'm not really a political expert, but maybe the problem I have a little bit with libertarianism is a little bit too much individualism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe like Ayn Rand and her writing is do only what's good for yourself, and let everyone do that. The problem with that is it doesn't have a concept of community.
Yeah.
And I believe, and so I've been studying sort of the Christian viewpoint from the book of Exodus and the ancient laws and the justice system. And there it teaches that you would deserve treatment based on your created nature as the image of God or your personhood. But you also deserve something based on your membership in the community. Whether you're a good member or not, by being a member, you deserve a certain treatment. So in the Old Testament, the landowners, which they're all landowners, were required to leave their fields unharvested every 7 years. And in that year, and they probably rotated, so it was probably every year there was empty fields. The poor were allowed to freely enter those fields and pick up the grain. Not because they were hard workers, not because they were good people, but simply because they were members of the community. And so that concept of justice, I think Americans and especially conservatives, we've lost that a little bit.
I think that's an interesting way to bring that up. So I noticed something interesting about it. First of all, the people who didn't own land, were they typically members? Were they typically citizens, or were they typically outsiders, aliens, people that were not Israelite?
Yeah, the Bible actually specifies. So in the law, it mentions, so there's two kind of justice things. There was leaving the field undone, and then the seventh day of rest, which Jewish call the Sabbath. And in Exodus 23, when it's given this law, it says that you are to rest on the seventh day so that your son, your workers, and the alien may be refreshed. So the reason that you had a day off was not really for yourself. It was so that the people who worked for you and the people who were not citizens were guaranteed a day of rest, which we would call labor laws.
Right.
So it was saying because they're a sojourner, because they're an immigrant, because they're a non-citizen, they have to be protected. And so they're allowed to eat food from fields, and they're allowed to have a day off. And the idea being you need justice, you need laws to protect people who can't protect themselves. And
Totally
the
agree
vulnerable.
with that.
Yeah, the
And let
vulnerable
me
are always,
go ahead. Finish your thought there. I'm sorry.
yeah, so the vulnerable are always the poor, the socially marginalized, the
Right.
non-citizens, the people without the power.
So God in the Old Testament, we do see he has a particular concern. You see it in the prophets and in the law for poor people, for widows, for orphans, for the laborer. And I don't know where the quote is taken from, but I specifically remember James referencing rich people keeping back wages of their workers, and the Lord of Sabaoth he's gonna judge them for that. He's heard those cries, and so God is concerned about social justice and about people being treated fairly. But by the same token, he didn't necessarily say you have to pick it up for them and take it to them.
Yeah.
They have a part to play as well, because we don't want to encourage laziness and a lack of industry and dependence. So I think there's a balance there that needs, and I'll be honest with you, I think you brought up a great point also about libertarianism. I mean, I'm probably 70% libertarian, and I've read some Ayn Rand stuff, and I like a lot of what she says. But I'll be very honest, her she's anti-philanthropy, she's anti-benevolence, anti-giving. She thinks giving is a virtue. She thinks, or a vice. She thinks selfishness is a virtue. I don't believe that. I do, however, agree that we want to be very careful that we allow, especially the overarching federal government, to force us to be virtuous.
Yeah.
That can get scary, because when they then determine that virtue is something that is far from virtue,
yeah,
and yet it becomes the law, that can be a very scary situation. But I think it's a great point that God was concerned about the poor and directed his people to provide means of rest. And I think, I'm definitely not an anarchist. I think there is a place for government. There is a place for law, and because there's a place for government and law, and some of my friends won't like this, there is a place for some taxation. You have to have some funding of that government. I think we're way overboard on it. I think we spend way too much. I think we spend beyond what we bring in. I don't think those are good things, but I do think there must be a mechanism to raise funds in order to have, and you have to have that retributive justice like you talked about earlier for crime. So, quick question for you, and in the Old Testament, if someone stole something, do you know what the penalty and/or what they were supposed to do if they stole something?
Yeah, it depended on what they stole, how long they had it, if they disposed of it. So there was degrees of stealing, as it were.
Yeah.
If they were caught immediately, they had to pay like double. If they sold it or killed it or ate it, disposed of it, then they had to pay back, I think, 7 times. And if they could not pay, they were basically hired out for 7 years.
More or less a bond servant.
So became a bond servant to work off the debt.
Yeah.
And with a maximum of 7 years of service.
So they really didn't go to prison for stealing.
There were no prisons when God gave the law, there were no prison.
Yeah.
You either paid up front or you worked it off.
And so the concept too, I think that we do need to kind of, because sometimes the Old Testament gets a bad rap for, quote, slavery. And that's not really slavery. What that is, in that particular case, is justice. You stole from me, you couldn't pay it off, so now you're going to work it off. You're going to pay me back. You're going to pay your debt. And it was not, hey, we're going to cut your right hand off, because that makes no sense, because now you've just created a person who is either going to starve to death or become dependent on the government or society even more.
Yeah, the slave laws, the slave laws, if you want to call them slave laws, were a rehabilitation program. So there were provisions. So when we think slavery, we automatically think chattel slavery in America, of
Which we
African Americans.
condemn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what the Bible says is when you deal with slaves, you cannot kidnap them. If you kidnap a person, or if you're found with a kidnapped person, you'll be executed.
Yeah.
Well, immediately, chattel slavery in America would have ceased to exist because everyone would have been executed.
Every one of them was kidnapped. Yeah.
Yeah. Or and the slave owners who bought and sold later would have been killed by Old Testament law because they possessed the kidnapped person. So you couldn't kidnap. So there's no forced slavery. It was all voluntary. Secondly, you could not separate families, which is one of the horrors of American slavery. Is that
absolutely
mothers
horror.
You weren't allowed to separate families.
It's also a horror of our immigration system.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, again, I just don't have that deep concern about immigration. I really don't. And maybe I'm a Pollyanna and naive. I don't know. But I just haven't seen that it's doing a great damage to our society, even illegal immigration. Sure, we need to punish murderers. Okay, absolutely. We need to punish thieves. There needs to be justice. I understand that. But we definitely should not be separating. If someone's willing to walk all the way from Guatemala or Honduras or Nicaragua with their family, there's got to be a reason they're willing to make that trek and take the chance. They deserve at least a fair hearing to find out what's going on.
Yeah, so the separating families that's unchristian, that's unjust. God talks about that. But it even goes further. When I studied this a few months ago, I was shocked. If a slave ran away, you were not allowed to send them back. If a slave ran away and showed up at your door, you were required to give them housing and food. It was against the law to send them back. So basically, if you were a slave and you didn't like being a slave, you could run away and people were required to take care of you, which protected them. And you can compare that to the fugitive slave law in America, where there were bounty hunters hunting down slaves from the South. But then you were not allowed to physically damage slaves. If you knocked a slave's tooth out,
he was freed, right?
He was freed.
Yeah.
Well, you compare that to American slavery, they would have all been freed.
Yeah.
And then finally, and maybe the greatest thing about it was at the end of 7 years, or when their debt was paid off, the owner of them was required to, from his own...
That maybe not all African Americans got at the end of the Civil War and after Reconstruction.
Yeah. So when you decided to hire or buy a slave in the Old Testament, you were agreeing to provide for them, care for them, and set them up for a successful life when they left. Well, that's a rehabilitation program.
Yeah,
when you compare that to the American justice system, if you steal, you're put into prison for 5 years. You become a felon. You lose your rights to vote, to own a firearm.
To drive sometimes.
Yeah. Then you're introduced to prison culture, which is never good for anybody.
Yeah.
And when you get out, you can't get a job. So when people talk about the Old Testament harsh and God's God of anger, it's actually much more just in the Old Testament than it is in America.
Yeah.
Because the prison system destroys people's lives and makes it almost impossible for them to reintegrate back into normal life.
Well, another, that's a great segue. I just heard on the news here, Louisville is doing something different in the two neighborhoods, Russell neighborhood and Portland, which are both considered the West End. They were given a grant. I don't know where the grant came from. I didn't catch all that. But the mayor, along with the police force, they're going to try something for first-time drug offenders. Rather than lock them up, they're going to use that grant money to put them into treatment programs and rehabilitation programs, leave them in their communities, and try to help them break their dependence off of the drugs.
Yeah.
And I think there's another idea that I think libertarians, I think sometimes libertarians need to consider incremental gains, and I think sometimes they like go for everything all at once. And I think rather than necessarily legalizing every drug, how about let's work for decriminalization first?
Right.
Decriminalization is far different. This is a person that if all you're going to do is lock somebody up because they got high on meth or they got high on heroin, well, you've taken maybe a mother or father away from her child. I'm not saying they're good parents. I'm just saying you're separating families. You're taking away oftentimes a breadwinner. You're taking them away from their support system. If they did have a church or a synagogue or a community or something, a network, they're separated from that. Then they're put in jail or prison. Then, as you said, they come out with a record. It's extremely difficult to overcome that. And what I find really, it's hard for me to understand this, but I find this even often among people who call themselves Christians. Well, they shouldn't have done the crime. Well, yeah, and then I'm gonna really make people mad. But then when the president breaks a law or something, well, God only has sinners to use.
Yeah. You look hard enough, everyone. Yeah. You look hard enough in every one of them. If you look hard enough, everyone. Yeah.
We're all sinners. No doubt about that.
And I've heard people say, well, if you look hard enough, then everyone's committed a crime. So you shouldn't judge the president. It's like, well, that's not how it works. That's not justice.
Well, aren't people that voted for him typically very strong law and order folks?
Yeah.
Isn't the number one reason they want to deport illegal aliens is because they, quote, broke the law?
Yeah.
They're kind of that's a little bit inconsistent on that moral and moral philosophy there, I think.
Yeah, unless people take it the wrong way. If Hillary Clinton broke the law, she should be put in jail too.
Right.
Fair. It should be fair. You break the law, you face the consequences. But one of the biggest problems in minority and low-income communities is the lack of intact families.
Sure.
Fatherlessness, for example. Well, where do the fathers go? They usually are in prison. So, yeah, that father is paying for his crime. Meanwhile, the family he left behind is dysfunctional and the community is breaking down, which creates more crime. So if we're against crime, let's be against crime comprehensively.
I agree.
Just across the board.
And and if you're looking at it from an Ayn Rand point of view for a moment, a selfish point of view, I wonder, I don't wonder, I know that if you take a father out of a home, you create poverty in that home. Really, either all, statistically, two-parent families just do better. The kids do better. They do better financially. But we simultaneously created the war on poverty and the war on drugs about the same time. I think the war on drugs, Johnson declared war on poverty, and then just a few years later, Nixon declared war on drugs. And what do we have? Far more crime and far more drugs.
Yeah.
And I think that by putting these people in prison for smoking a joint or using heroin, and I'm not talking about violent people who are fighting and killing one another in the streets. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a totally different issue. You actually are costing society and the American government and the American taxpayer more money because of the amount of welfare that we have to provide. Because one thing we don't do typically in this country is just let people starve and go homeless. We typically don't do that. I agree. Yeah. So when we talk about social justice, we're talking about it more. We don't live under the Old Testament economy any longer. We're not under that system, but the principles are still there, and you can see those in Jesus' teachings, right?
Yeah.
And it's today it's voluntary. So if I say somebody should look after his neighbor or should care for his neighbor, I am not advocating that Washington, D.C. force me to look after my neighbor. I'm just saying you should do it. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, so MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. is an example. He had kind of two messages. It was choose love over
Mm-hmm.
hate and give people their rights. And he wanted the government to give people rights, especially black people who were being segregated, give them their civil rights that every American citizen should have, every human should
Protect those rights.
protect those rights.
Yeah.
And then he was saying love is the motivation that should help people, but he wasn't saying Washington should legislate love. He
Right.
was saying legislate civil rights so that every human has basic human rights. But then he called everyone to love, and that was sort of what would make us a great nation. So I think that's a similar mindset of
I
the
agree.
government should protect rights, and then every person should be encouraged and pushed to love their neighbor.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, why don't we jump into a little bit of Matthew 5? We got about 13 minutes left here. Is that all right with you?
Sure. Yeah.
I think that it's interesting because we're going to jump in verse 21. And I think it's interesting that we're going to find right off the bat that Jesus takes that Old Testament law and rather than diminishing it, he actually raises it even to a higher level. In verse, where was it? Verse 17, he said, think not that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And if you, I'll read a verse, we'll talk about it, and then we'll just go from there. We got down to verse 21, and he says in verse 21, ye have heard that was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. So we just talked about that. In the Old Testament, if you murdered, there had to be some form of a trial. I think it had to be at least three witnesses, two or three witnesses, and you had to have the opportunity to defend yourself. You couldn't just be executed. And if I'm not mistaken, representatives from society actually participated in. They used stoning as a form of capital punishment, and it was a community affair. It wasn't something that you relegated to an executioner necessarily. So go ahead. No, you go ahead.
The whole law was built around a society that was community oriented.
Yes.
Which you do have to take into account when you look at the Old Testament. It works in small communities built around each other. It may not work as well, that system in a large, urban environment or agriculture or something like that.
Well, I think that let's take just a second to talk about that. Our original system was a federal republic, and the 13 states were independent, sovereign governmental institutions, and they formed more of a confederacy in the beginning, and so there was a division of power. And I do think that community gets lost as it gets larger, right? It's difficult to maintain. I mean, I hear people often compare. I hear a lot of social justice type people or this Alexandria Cortez or Bernie Sanders talk about, well, what about Denmark? What about Sweden? What about Norway? What about Israel? They have these very generous social welfare programs. Well, I do think there is a certain amount of practicality that works because they're somewhat homogenous.
Yeah.
Number one. And they're a lot smaller, and they do have a lot of participation by the people who are in the system. It's not as much top down as it is the community actually wants what they're getting. And so they don't begrudge the taxation that it requires in order to take care of everybody. And I don't know that you can do that at a nation of 325 million. But I think if the federal government weren't so overarching in our country, you might be able to do it in a county level or a city level. If people chose to do that, and then it would kind of give folks an opportunity to sort of experiment. And hey, I like that very almost like a kibbutzim, in Israel. I want to go live there. Or the next person, no, this city over here, they're very like a Randian objectivist, Ayn Rand, do your own thing. And we could kind of there would be some voluntary associations that we might be able to experiment a little bit. But I think what the left and the right do in this country, they both use government power to try to coerce us to do what they think is virtuous and right. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
I can go on a soapbox there.
Yeah. Well, if Democrat or Republicans were about small government, then why have they never reduced the size of the government?
Correct.
So
I think the last one to really do that was Cool Cal, maybe.
That's been a while.
That's been a while. Totally agree. So back to Jesus. So he says, hey, murder's wrong, and you were right to punishment. But then he says, because the verse prior, he says, look, your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Okay? You got to do better than they do. And he says, but I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. And I'm going to meddle again. I think if you tweet it or Facebook it, it's still wrong too. I don't think it's proper to call someone a lying crazy dog on Twitter, or I don't think it's proper to just throw accusations of lying and you're a fool and you're a snowflake and you're an idiot and I think we need to calm that rhetoric down. And I think Jesus tells us right here that you shouldn't treat your brother that way. And he addresses who our brother is, doesn't he, in other parts of Scripture.
Yeah, it's those you come in contact with.
Exactly. In fact, it's every human. In fact, the story that I'm sure you and I both heard preached and taught a lot, the Good Samaritan out of Luke chapter 10, I believe. In that particular story, the hero of that story was the outcast, persecuted alien of society, the half-breed, the racially impure, so to speak, in their mind. He was the one that best emulated treating your brother correctly. And the guy that he helped was some random stranger he found on the side of the road who had been beaten up. And for all he knew, that guy might have, quote, deserved it.
Yeah.
But the religious leader, the political leader, they passed on by. They didn't pay any attention to that man. But in this passage, Jesus says, he doesn't say whosoever's angry with his brother. He says angry with his brother without a cause. So there is such a thing as righteous anger, right? Righteous indignation.
Yeah, when you see injustice. When you see injustice,
correct.
You should feel angry. You should have some emotional response to that. Yeah, it's the attitude is displayed with the name calling, the cursing. It's not you want to demean this person. You want to tear them down.
Huh.
Well, the ultimate end to tearing someone down is to snuff their life out, to extinguish them. And so murder is just the end of the road for demeaning language, for a demeaning spirit.
So first of all, he's not saying that calling someone a fool or an idiot or a dog is equivalent to murder, but he is saying that attitude of diminishing that human being and constantly berating them and destroying their worth as a human, making fun, whether it's bullying or whether it's, and again, let's just be honest. People who use drugs are still human beings, and people who cross borders without permission are still human beings, and we shouldn't demean them as human beings. That doesn't mean we don't deal with the problem, but we shouldn't demean them. And these words, when he calls someone a fool, what does that kind of mean? What are you saying, or what is that word raka? Can you give us I did a little reading on it too, but give us a little background. What's that? What's he going for there?
So Jesus, in the context of the Old Testament. So the book of Proverbs has quite a bit to say about a fool.
Mm-hmm.
We don't use the word the same way. When we say fool, we just mean a dumb person or an idiot or maybe. But when the Old Testament uses fool, it's someone who has left reason, who has rejected God, who is sort of, you could even use mentally ill here. I think maybe left reality or has
Mm-hmm.
chosen to just do everything the way it shouldn't be done. It's like it's a basic rejection of God's reality. So when you called someone a
Consistently
fool,
poor choices, not wise, right?
right? But it's a much more comprehensive sense of.
Mm-hmm.
So a fool is someone who has rejected God, rejected God's reality. Um, so I think we can still call people fools when they, for instance, join the Ku Klux Klan. That's a fool. Someone who
I
thinks
would
that you
agree.
can, right? So, yeah, you can still be a fool if you are doing foolish things.
Right.
But in this sense, the term "raka," it's an insult. It's saying you are less than you should be. You've rejected reality. You have diminished yourself. God should punish you. God should reject.
Isn't there almost a connotation when the word rock was used that you're a worthless person?
Like a fool. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's get out of here. You're not worth anything to us.
Yes. And I think we
Um,
need to be really careful with that with any human being. Again, you and I believe in justice. There has to be justice for murder. There has to be justice for assaults. There has to be justice for rapes. And again, let me be super clear on this. Those who hide criminals, rapists, whether it's a church leader or a coach or a teacher or a parent, they are culpable also. They're guilty of a crime as well. Let's be very clear about that. We're not trying to soft soap anything here, okay? But to call someone who has not committed a heinous crime or is not in, like you talked about, rejecting God's reality. I think in the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 14, the fool said in his heart, there's no God, or he's kind of like he's saying no to God. I don't want anything to do with God and righteousness.
yeah.
That's a different aspect. And I think you and I, again, I think we would agree on this. We would never advocate government force, like we would never advocate blasphemy laws or not even probably blue laws. We don't necessarily think that you should force people not to work on Sunday or not sell liquor on a Sunday or things like that. We're not advocating for government force here. We're talking again on a horizontal level. How do we treat one another? And vertically, how does God want us to treat one another? Did I say that right?
Yeah. I think you look in the text here. It says whoever says you fool will be liable to hellfire. In other words, divine judgment.
Right.
Whoever kills someone is liable for the public justice, human justice. The Old Testament is clear. We have to read this in the context of what Jesus was saying. He was talking about the law, and the law said murder is a death penalty. But he's saying God sees more than that. He sees your heart. He sees your attitudes. If you are in your heart demeaning someone, you are headed down the same path as a murderer. So it's the hate. It's the hate for the human. You don't have to hate a murderer. You don't have to hate a rapist. You can still put them in jail. You can still punish them. You can still execute them even. You don't have to hate them.
Mm-hmm.
And to not kill someone but hate them is not virtue. It's evil. So Martin Luther King Jr., he was about nonviolence. And so I've been reading a lot about nonviolence and how that works. And so one of the quotes he has is nonviolence means avoiding not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. You not only refuse to shoot a man, but you refuse to hate him. That's what Jesus is saying. And Martin Luther King got that from this passage. He read this and he says, not only will I not kill someone, but God doesn't even want me to hate him.
Yeah.
And so the Pharisees didn't get that. The Pharisees never killed anybody until they killed Jesus.
Right.
But they hated everybody. And so they were guilty.
Go ahead, finish your.
No, That's it.
Well, and if you connect it to his thought down in verse number 27 and 28, where Jesus talks about, you've heard it was said in old time, hey, don't commit adultery. That's one of the 10 commandments. But he says, Jesus said, whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Again, in a former life, I have heard this preached that, well, if you have lustful thoughts, and I'm going to define it here. I think what Jesus is saying is, if in your heart you're thinking about and planning to commit adultery with a woman who's not your wife,
yeah,
you've committed that sin in your heart, okay? But I've heard it preached in the past that, well, you're just as guilty. No, you're not just as guilty. What he's saying is every bad action starts in the heart and the mind. And if you, as Martin Luther King said, if you fight it in the mind, you fight it in the heart, you feed good thoughts, you feed loving thoughts, you feed proper thoughts, you think on good and wholesome and virtuous thoughts, then you're going to prevent yourself from committing a heinous crime or a heinous act against society or against your family or against your neighbors. And it starts, and I think I'm just going to say something. I am concerned with the level of rhetoric in society, especially among professed Christians, because I think it betrays a hatred in the heart. And that concerns me. It's, again, you talked about it earlier. You don't have to hate the murderer or the rapist necessarily to want justice for society and for the person and for the family that was wrong. But you also don't have to hate that person who crosses that line illegally. You don't have to hate those people to want a just solution to the problem. Why can't we talk about it and work out some solutions? Because frankly, we have not an unemployment problem in our country. We have an employment problem now. We don't even have enough workers. And if we shut off the flow of these folks, we're actually going to hurt our own economy, our own social security system that's already in place. We need to think about these things rationally and kindly and lovingly. And I think that's what's missing from the rhetoric today.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to use a non-Christian principle or maybe a modification, the concept of karma. Karma says you put out bad energy, you will receive bad energy. Well, that's not quite what the Bible says, but the law of sowing and reaping. But if you do believe in karma, and which, many people in America are not Christians, do you think that hateful thoughts, hateful energy, hateful intentions disappears, goes nowhere? If karma is real, you put hate out, you're going to receive hate. And if Americans put hate towards immigrants, murderers, violent people, what will America receive? So if we sow hate, we'll reap it.
Absolutely.
And you don't get away with hatred, because hatred destroys your soul, it destroys community, it destroys nations. It's the cause of so much evil in America. We say we don't want slavery, we say we don't want racism, and yet we treat people less than they should be treated because of their behavior. Well, if you go back 200 years ago, they would have said it's because of the way they act. Well, the same argument is being used today. How do you defeat that? You put love out. You love your neighbor. You love the criminal. You love the immigrant. And you love all your neighbors. And it creates a spirit. It creates a community. It creates an atmosphere. If you're a Christian, that's what God wants. If you're a non-Christian, that's what community and energy and karma and healthy.
So maybe we should treat people the way we want them to be rather than the way they are.
Yeah. I mean, if you treat people like slaves, self-protection means they act like it.
Yeah.
If you treat people like children, they act like children.
They're going to be childish. Well, let's back up and let's do 2 more verses and then let's wrap it up. Fair enough?
Yeah.
So if you go to verses 23 and 24, why don't you read those 2 verses, if you would, please?
So if you offer your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift.
So again, we're still Old Testament context, and Old Testament theologically is prior to Christ's death and then his resurrection, right? So we're still under that Old Testament idea. So someone's coming in and they're bringing a sacrifice to God or some sort of an offering to God. Here's what I want to focus on. It in verse 23, it's focused on me doing the right thing, not on me trying to force you to do the right thing. And I find that over and over and over again with Jesus' teachings. Hey, you need to repent. You need to change. You need to do the right thing. And he doesn't even really say that you might not have even done anything against your brother. He just has something against you. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe he doesn't know why you did something. But oh man, I remember that, the other guy has something against me. God really doesn't want your gift or your sacrifice or your offering until you get right on a horizontal level. And he puts it on me to come to you, not for you to wait to come to me. And I really like that emphasis.
Yeah. It's so if you think of it, especially in the context of the law, you're required to bring gifts. So let's translate that into our language. God cares more about community and more about relationships than he cares about the law.
Yes.
And he's saying that part of the law is to create community. So if you are keeping a letter of the law and breaking the spirit of the law, you are wrong. And so relationships and good community is God's priority. So he creates laws to facilitate that.
Yeah.
But you don't get to say, well, I'm right with God and I worship God, but I don't have a community. I don't love my brother. There's problems that I haven't fixed. God's like, that's a Pharisee. That's what the Pharisees do. And he says, you do everything in your power to reconcile, to create the fellowship, to create the bond. Then you can come back and worship. And it's the church's model in this too. Matthew chapter 18. Mm-hmm. Jesus says, if a brother sins against you, go to him. He sinned against you, but you go to him and show him his sin, which means you do the work to convince him. And if he hears you, you've gained your brother. So even in the church, we're supposed to prioritize community. And it goes back to this concept of, even within the Christian model, it's the Trinity. The Trinity is a community of love, and it always has been. And that's the model for reality. It's the model for Christian life. And when you have a community of love, people are happy. And when you don't, people are oppressed.
Yeah. Back to that last thought you talked about Jesus and getting right if your brother has sinned against you. That model, I think, would work in almost any community situation, not just the church. So if you had done something against me, I go talk to you and you don't listen, what's the next step? Well, I'm supposed to bring 2 or 3 people with me and say, hey, other guy, this was wrong. You shouldn't have done this. Here's why. Can we make this right? If you still refuse, I'm supposed to bring the community. I think church itself is just a called out assembly, right? So it can apply to other communities. I'm supposed to bring the group and say, look, you got to get this right. And if you don't, there is justice. You're cast out. You're no longer part of the community. That's the punishment. And so it isn't that we're saying there's never punishment. I think sometimes people think when you talk about love, well, you just mean let people walk all over you and people can do whatever they want. No, that's not at all what we're talking about. There are consequences and there are remedies.
Yeah, so, I mean, we have discipline. And if you're a Christian church, discipline means preventing evil, correcting evil, addressing injustice, protecting the community. And when you find someone in the community who is bent on destruction, you remove them from the community.
You have to.
And you have to, or else a little leaven leavens the whole lump.
One and bad apple, right?
Yeah. You can't let evil people thrive. You must deal with them.
Absolutely.
And that's what a just society does. Social justice means creating a society where good flourishes and evil is removed or dealt with or protected or put in prison or whatever.
Good place to stop. So I think our purpose, right? Have a civil dialogue, get involved with one another. I think Jesus' words, love your neighbor as yourself, are a good way to end that right there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. If you hang on for just a minute, we'll talk. Appreciate everybody who viewed. Just going to ask if you got something out of the broadcast, do you think it's worthwhile, share it. Ask other people to go to my page, Curt, the other guy, like the page, follow it. And you can always listen to these broadcasts later by just clicking on the videos, and you can listen to them as a podcast. So have a great night. Thanks, other guy. We'll talk for a minute. Everybody take care.